Story number 1.
When we bought the house on Maple Lane, it was a dream come true. My wife, Emily, and I had been searching for months, but nothing seemed quite right. Then we found it. A charming Victorian house nestled in the woods just outside of town. It had everything we wanted: space, a large yard, and an air of history that made it feel special. The real estate agent told us it had been vacant for a few years, and the previous owners had moved out after their children had grown up and left for college. We were excited. It was everything we needed, a place to start fresh, away from the busy city life. We had a small budget, but the price was reasonable, and after a little negotiation, we sealed the deal. We moved in during the fall, the leaves starting to turn bright shades of orange and yellow. It felt perfect. The first couple of weeks were blissful. We spent evenings unpacking, arranging furniture, and enjoying the quiet. The house had a strange charm to it: creaky floors, high ceilings, and large windows that let in the kind of soft light you only get in the fall. The air smelled fresh, and every room seemed to hold a promise of comfort and peace. But it didn't take long for things to feel off. It started with small things: a door that would be left open when we were sure it had been closed, a light flickering on and off. At first, I thought it was just the old wiring. This house was nearly a century old after all. Emily was more sensitive to it than I was, and she would often mention feeling like she wasn't alone, even when the house was empty. One night, I woke up to find Emily sitting up in bed, staring at the door. Her eyes were wide, and she looked pale. "Did you hear that?" she asked in a voice that wasn't quite herself. I asked her what she meant, but she just kept staring at the door, her face frozen in fear. "There was someone standing there," she said, "in the hallway." I thought she was just tired, maybe imagining things, but when I went to check, the hallway was empty. I reassured her that it was probably just a dream and that she should get some rest. She reluctantly agreed, and we went back to sleep. But it didn't stop there. The following week, Emily started seeing things. At first, it was just glimpses: a shadow in the corner of her eye, a figure standing in the doorway when she turned her head. She would say it looked like a person, but when she turned to face it, there was no one there. I thought it was stress from the move or lack of sleep, but Emily was becoming increasingly uneasy. One afternoon, while I was working in the study, Emily came into the room, her face pale. "I saw her again," she said, her voice trembling. "In the kitchen. I swear, I saw a woman standing by the counter. I don't know how, but she was just there." This time, I couldn't dismiss it. Emily wasn't the type to make things up, and I could see the genuine fear in her eyes. I walked with her into the kitchen, but there was no sign of anyone, just the same old room, dark oak cabinets, an old fridge, and the dim light from the window. I didn't know what to think. The next day, I decided to take a look at the house's history. I contacted the local historical society and learned a little more about the previous owners. The house had been built in the 1920s by a wealthy family, the Whitakers, who had lived there for decades. But the records also mentioned something unusual: a tragic event. In the late 1940s, the Whitakers' youngest daughter, Lily, had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. The story went that she had been playing in the attic when she fell and hit her head. They had found her body several hours later, and it was said to have been a very traumatic event for the family. I didn't know what to make of it. I told Emily about what I'd found, but she was already too terrified to stay in the house by herself. She started avoiding certain rooms, especially the upstairs where the attic was. She told me she felt like someone was watching her, like Lily was still there, lingering in the shadows. One evening, as the sun began to set, Emily and I were sitting on the porch. We hadn't been talking much lately, the tension in the house making everything feel heavy. As we sat there, I saw it, just for a second: a figure in the upstairs window, standing still, watching us. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to Emily, who had already noticed it. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her face pale. "It's her. I know it's her." We stood up and rushed inside, and I went upstairs to check the room. There was nothing there, of course. No person, no shadow, just the empty room, the curtains gently swaying in the evening breeze. But when I returned downstairs, Emily was already in the living room, her eyes wide with terror. "She followed us," she whispered. "She's here." We spent the next few days trying to understand what was going on. I didn't want to believe in ghosts, but the strange events in the house were becoming harder to ignore. One evening, Emily suggested we contact a medium, someone who could help us communicate with the spirit to see if we could understand why Lily's presence was lingering. I was skeptical, but I agreed. The medium, a woman named Grace, arrived a few days later. She seemed calm and collected, but when she stepped inside the house, her demeanor changed. "I feel her," she said, her voice low. "She's here. She's been waiting." Grace led us through the house, stopping in front of the staircase. "Lily," she called softly, "I know you're here. We're not here to harm you. We just want to understand." The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and the air grew thick as though something was pressing down on us. The medium spoke again, asking Lily why she was still here. After a few moments of silence, the room seemed to respond. A loud bang echoed from the attic. "I think she's trying to communicate," Grace said, her voice shaking slightly. "She's still holding on to something. She doesn't want to leave." We followed Grace upstairs, and she entered the attic, where she began a ritual to help Lily move on. She told us that sometimes spirits get stuck, especially when their deaths are sudden and violent. Lily, it seemed, had never been able to fully process her death, and she had stayed in the house, unable to find peace. The process took several hours, but eventually the atmosphere in the house began to shift. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. Emily and I both felt a sense of relief, though we couldn't explain it. The medium told us that Lily had finally moved on, and the house would be at peace from now on. Since that night, things have been different. The house feels lighter, and the eerie presence is gone. Emily can sleep without fear, and the strange noises and sightings have stopped. We still live here in the house on Maple Lane, but it's no longer the place of fear and uncertainty it once was. Lily has found peace, and so have we. Story the end.
Story number 2.
When Rachel and Tom bought their first home, they were overjoyed. After years of renting, they finally found a place they could call their own. The house was a charming 2-story in an up-and-coming neighborhood surrounded by young families and mature oak trees. The backyard was large enough for a garden, and the inside was spacious with an open floor plan. It was a perfect fit for them, or so they thought. The house had been built in the 1950s, and although it was in good condition, there was an undeniable feeling of age about it. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and there were faint smells of old wood and dust, but nothing that seemed unusual. They moved in, excited to begin this new chapter of their lives, and for the first few weeks, everything felt just right. They unpacked boxes, decorated rooms, and made the house truly their own. Then, about a month after they moved in, things started to feel off. The first incident happened on a Tuesday evening. Tom had been working late, and Rachel was in the kitchen making dinner when she heard what sounded like someone walking around upstairs. She figured it was Tom home earlier than expected, but when she called out to him, there was no response. Curious, she went upstairs to check, but the house was silent. She found nothing out of the ordinary. Maybe it was just the house settling, she thought. Old houses have a way of making strange noises. A few days later, Rachel came home from grocery shopping and found a light on in the living room. She was certain she had turned it off before leaving, but the switch was on. Thinking she might have forgotten, she shrugged it off and turned the light off again. That night, after Tom had gone to bed, she heard a faint whisper coming from the hallway. It was so soft she thought she might have imagined it. But it came again, clearer this time, like someone was trying to get her attention. Rachel? It sounded like her name, but no one was there. Her heart raced as she sat in the dark, waiting for the sound to come again. But it didn't. She got up, checked the hallway, and found nothing. The next few days were uneventful, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't quite as quiet as it seemed. There was an energy in the air, a heaviness she couldn't explain. Then came the first truly alarming event. One afternoon, Rachel was cleaning the guest bedroom, which had been mostly used for storage. She was making the bed when she noticed something strange. The mirror on the wall, an old antique piece, was slightly tilted, angled in a way that seemed off. She hadn't touched it, and it wasn't something that had been moved by the wind. She adjusted it back into place, then went about her day. But later that evening, when she walked past the room again, the mirror was tilted once more, this time even further than before. Rachel felt a sudden chill crawl down her spine. She had only been in the room once since moving in, and nothing had been disturbed. But now this, it didn't make sense. The mirror continued to shift over the next few days. Rachel checked it every time she passed, and each time it was at a different angle, as though someone was purposefully moving it. By the end of the week, she couldn't ignore it any longer. She decided to mention it to Tom, but he didn't seem too concerned. He thought it was probably just the way the mirror was hung, and maybe it had become loose. Rachel wasn't so sure, though. It felt intentional, as if someone or something was trying to get her attention. The next weekend, they hosted a small housewarming party. Their friends had seen the house during the move-in and were excited to see how it had come together. As the evening wore on, Rachel and Tom mingled with their guests in the living room, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Every time she looked toward the staircase, it felt like there was someone standing at the top, just out of sight. When she'd glance away, the feeling would fade, but it kept happening, over and over again. She tried to ignore it, but the sensation was unnerving. Later that night, after everyone had left, Rachel was cleaning up in the kitchen when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. She froze, heart pounding in her chest. Tom was in the living room watching TV, and the guests had all gone home. She went upstairs, but there was no one there. She checked every room, opened every closet, and found nothing. Her hands trembled as she returned to the kitchen, convinced that she had heard someone walking above her. Tom tried to calm her, but he was just as shaken by the experience. The following night, they both stayed up late, listening intently for any sounds that might explain the footsteps. Nothing came, and eventually, they both fell asleep. But the next morning, they found something even more disturbing. Rachel was getting ready for work when she noticed that the small painting in the hallway, something they had just hung up a few days earlier, was missing. The hook was still there, but the painting was gone. She called out to Tom, but he hadn't seen it either. It wasn't just that the painting had fallen off or been moved by accident, it had completely disappeared. They searched the house, hoping it had been moved somewhere else, but there was no sign of it. As the days passed, other small things started to go missing. An empty coffee cup, a pair of shoes, a book from the shelf. It was as if items were vanishing from thin air. Each time they noticed something missing, they both felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't long before the disturbances grew worse. One night, Tom was sitting on the couch when he saw a shadow move across the living room wall. He blinked, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but when he looked again, the shadow was still there. It wasn't his. There was no one else in the room. He quickly stood up, but as soon as he did, the shadow disappeared. His heart was racing. He didn't know what to make of it, but he was beginning to feel the weight of the house's strange energy. The final straw came one Friday evening when they decided to go out for dinner. They had been out for several hours, and when they returned home, they were greeted by a cold draft. It wasn't the kind of draft you'd expect from an open window or door. It was as if the house itself had become colder, like it was breathing in and out, exhaling a frigid gust of air. When they stepped inside, the lights flickered as if someone was playing with the switches. They rushed inside, locking the door behind them, and noticed that the entire house felt wrong. That night, they both had trouble sleeping. Around 3 a.m., Rachel woke up suddenly, as if something had disturbed her. When she turned to Tom, she noticed he was still sound asleep. But then she saw it, a figure standing at the foot of their bed. It wasn't solid, but a shadowy shape, a vague outline of a person. The figure stood motionless, staring at her, and the air in the room grew heavier, colder. Rachel's heart was pounding as she reached for Tom, shaking him awake. But when she looked again, the figure was gone. The room was empty. Tom woke up, but Rachel couldn't bring herself to explain what she had seen. She was too terrified to say anything, too shaken by the experience. The next morning, they called a local paranormal investigator who arrived later that day with equipment to measure electromagnetic fields and temperature fluctuations. After spending several hours in the house, the investigator confirmed what they had feared. The house was haunted. She explained that a family had lived there decades ago, and the wife had died under mysterious circumstances. The spirit of the wife, angry and confused, seemed to have lingered in the home, causing the strange occurrences. The investigator performed a cleansing ritual, and from that day forward, the disturbances stopped. The house no longer felt oppressive, and the cold spots disappeared. The missing items eventually reappeared, and the strange shadows never returned. Rachel and Tom never forgot their experience in that house. They eventually moved to a different neighborhood, but the memory of the haunting lingered in their minds. They had learned that some houses hold on to more than just memories. They can hold something else entirely. Story the end.
Story number 3.
We had just moved into our new house on a quiet street, a sleepy little neighborhood on the edge of town. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple 2-story home with a large backyard and a few overgrown trees. The house itself was charming, built in the 1950s, with a brick exterior and wide windows that let in a lot of light. The previous owners, an elderly couple, had lived there for decades before deciding to move closer to their children. The house had been empty for a while, but we were excited. It felt like a fresh start. The first few weeks were perfect. The house was in great condition, and we spent our evenings unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting comfortable in our new space. My husband, Mark, and I enjoyed the slow pace of settling in, and our kids, Lily and James, were excited about the big backyard. Everything seemed ideal, but then strange things began to happen. It started with small noises at night, creaks and groans from the floorboards, whispers in the distance. At first, I brushed it off. Old houses make noise, I told myself. The wind was probably just playing tricks on me. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard something that stopped me cold. It was a soft tapping on the window. I stood still, listening. It wasn't the wind, it was too deliberate. Someone was tapping on the glass. I pulled the curtain back, but there was no one there. The yard was empty, the moonlight casting long shadows over the lawn. I stood there for a moment, feeling uneasy, before I convinced myself it was just a branch from the tree brushing against the window. The next few days were calm, but the feeling of unease never quite left me. I told Mark about the tapping, but he just shrugged it off. "It's probably a branch," he said. "Old houses settle. It's nothing to worry about." But then, things escalated. One afternoon, while Mark was at work and the kids were outside playing, I was in the kitchen when I heard it again. This time, it was a clear voice, a whisper coming from the hallway. It wasn't just a sound. I could feel it, like a presence in the house. I walked cautiously into the hall, but there was no one there. The voice had stopped, but I felt a coldness in the air, as if something had been standing right there. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Was it my imagination? A trick of the mind? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was off about this house. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat down with Mark in the living room. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I needed to talk to him about what had been happening. I told him about the voice and the tapping on the window. His face softened, but he still looked skeptical. "Maybe it's just the house settling," he said again. "You're probably just tired." But something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. It felt dismissive, like he didn't want to acknowledge that something could be wrong. I didn't press the issue, but I could tell he wasn't taking me seriously. The next night, Mark had to work late, and I was left alone with the kids. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard it again. The whispering voice, faint but unmistakable, came from the hallway. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed a flashlight and went toward the sound. The kids were asleep in their rooms, and the house felt unnervingly still. When I reached the hallway, the temperature dropped sharply. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I shone the flashlight around, but there was no one there. I checked the closets, peered into the rooms. Nothing. It was as if the house had held its breath, waiting. I stood in the hallway for a long time, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the hallway, near the stairs, a shadow flickered. It was brief, but it was there. Solid, dark, moving. My heart pounded as I rushed toward it, but by the time I reached the spot, it was gone. I felt like I had been holding my breath for minutes, and when I exhaled, the house seemed even quieter than before. The next day, I called Mark at work. My voice shook as I told him what had happened. I didn't expect him to believe me, but I needed him to know that something was wrong. He promised he'd be home early, and when he arrived, I asked him to stay with me. I didn't want to be in the house alone anymore. We decided to do some research on the property. The house had a history, nothing that seemed unusual at first. It had been built in the 1950s, but the records didn't show much about previous owners. But when I dug deeper, I found something unsettling. The house had once belonged to a family, the Millers, who had lived there for nearly 30 years. In the late 1980s, the husband, Thomas Miller, had died unexpectedly. The wife, Rachel, stayed in the house alone for several years before selling it and moving out of state. Neighbors had described Rachel as a quiet woman, but she had never seemed truly happy after Thomas passed. In fact, several neighbors recalled seeing her walking around the yard at night, even after she'd sold the house. One neighbor mentioned that she'd seen Rachel standing in the window, staring out into the darkness for hours at a time. The more I read, the more I began to feel the weight of the house's past pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel's sadness, or even her grief, had somehow lingered in the house. But what was more unsettling was the mention of her walking the halls long after she had moved out. The thought that something in the house was bound to the land, stuck in a place that felt so heavy, made my skin crawl. I didn't know what to do. The whispers had become more frequent, and now I could hear footsteps in the hall when no one was there. The temperature in certain rooms would drop inexplicably, and I felt a constant presence that I couldn't explain. Mark still didn't believe me, but I could tell he was starting to feel it too. One night, a week after Mark started to notice the strange occurrences himself, we both heard it, the distinct sound of footsteps walking down the hall. We were both awake this time, lying in bed, wide-eyed. The footsteps weren't just faint, they were deliberate, slow, and methodical, as if someone was walking through the house with purpose. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed Mark's hand, and we both went into the hallway together, flashlight in hand, ready to confront whatever was there. We reached the stairs, and that's when we saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, standing at the top of the stairs. It wasn't solid, but it was unmistakable. Mark froze, his face pale. "Who's there?" I called out, but the shadow didn't move. It simply stood there, still as a statue, watching us. Mark reached for my hand, but when he did, the shadow vanished. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, but when we finally made our way back to the bedroom, we knew we couldn't stay in that house any longer. The presence was too strong, too unnerving. The house had become a prison, and we couldn't escape it. The next day, we packed up our things and left. We didn't even wait for the real estate agent to come back to show the house. It was too much. We found a small apartment in town, and the night we slept there for the first time, we felt relief. The house on Maple Lane was behind us. We never told anyone about what happened, not in detail, but we knew we were right to leave. Whatever had lingered in that house, whether it was Rachel's grief or something else, had made it impossible to feel safe. To this day, I sometimes think about that house, the whispers and the footsteps. I wonder if the next owners will feel it too. Story the end.
Story number 4.
When Sarah and James moved into their new house in the quiet town of Willow Creek, they thought they had found their dream home. It was a spacious, 2-story brick house built in the early 1900s with a big front porch, wide windows, and a beautiful garden out back. The previous owners, an elderly couple, had decided to downsize, and the house had been well taken care of. It seemed perfect. For the first few weeks, everything was ideal. Sarah and James spent their evenings unpacking, arranging furniture, and enjoying their new space. The quiet neighborhood was peaceful, and the neighbors were friendly. They felt like they had made the right choice. However, things began to change shortly after they moved in. The first incident happened on a Sunday morning, about 2 weeks after they had settled in. Sarah was getting ready to go out for a run when she heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the second floor. She assumed it was James walking around, getting ready for the day, but when she checked the time, he wasn't up yet. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, But when Sarah went upstairs to investigate, the house was completely empty. "James?" she called out, but there was no answer. She walked through every room, but no one was there. She chalked it up to the house settling. Old houses often made strange noises, especially on cool mornings, but the feeling of unease lingered. Over the next week, Sarah began noticing other strange things. Lights would flicker on and off, and objects would occasionally shift position. One evening, she placed a glass on the kitchen counter, only to find it in a completely different spot the next morning. At first, she thought maybe she had moved it and forgotten, but after a few more incidents like that, she started to question her own memory. One night, while sitting on the couch with James, Sarah heard a faint whisper. She froze, her heart racing. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The voice was low and indistinct, like someone was speaking just beyond her hearing. She turned to James. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. James looked at her with a confused expression. "Hear what?" "I swear I just heard a voice." "Maybe it was the TV," he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. They both fell silent, trying to dismiss the eerie feeling that had settled in the room. The next day, Sarah took a walk in the garden to clear her head. As she passed by the old oak tree near the back fence, she noticed something odd, a small tarnished key lying on the ground, half buried in the dirt. She knelt down and picked it up. It was old, the metal worn smooth from years of use. It didn't look like it belonged to anything in the house, and it certainly wasn't something they had brought with them. "James," she called as she entered the house, holding the key out to him. "Look at this. I found it in the garden." James took the key from her, examining it closely. "Weird. Where do you think it came from?" "I don't know," Sarah said, feeling uneasy. "I've never seen it before." They didn't think much more of it, but later that night, after dinner, the strange happenings took a more alarming turn. The couple was sitting in the living room when they heard the sound of a door creaking open upstairs. Sarah looked at James, her eyes wide. "I didn't open any doors," she whispered, a chill running down her spine. James got up and went to check. As he walked through the hallway toward the staircase, the sound of the door creaking grew louder. It was coming from the master bedroom. He slowly pushed the door open, but the room was empty. The door was slightly ajar, but there was no sign of anyone inside. James felt a knot form in his stomach. "I don't know, Sarah," he said, looking back at her. "This is starting to feel strange." Sarah nodded in agreement. "I know, it's like something is here with us." The following days brought more unsettling occurrences. One morning, Sarah walked into the kitchen to find the pantry door wide open. She was certain she had closed it the night before, but there it was, hanging open, as though someone had been inside. She didn't know how to explain it, but she had an eerie feeling that the house wasn't as empty as it seemed. That night, Sarah decided to do some research on the house. She dug through old property records and even visited the local library to see if she could find any history on the previous owners. She discovered that the house had once belonged to the Whitmore family, who had lived there for several decades. The family had been well known in the area, but their story was shrouded in mystery. The wife, Margaret Whitmore, had passed away in the house under strange circumstances many years earlier, though no one could quite agree on the details. According to local gossip, Margaret had died unexpectedly, and rumors of strange occurrences in the house began soon after. Some neighbors claimed to have seen her wandering the halls at night, while others said they heard footsteps and voices when no one was around. Sarah's heart sank as she read the accounts. Could it be that the house was haunted? The next day, Sarah and James decided to investigate further. They went up to the attic, which had always seemed a little too dark and cluttered for Sarah's liking. They found an old trunk hidden in the corner, covered in dust. When they opened it, they discovered a collection of old photographs, letters, and personal items belonging to the Whitmore family. Among the items was a photograph of a woman, Margaret Whitmore. She looked much younger, smiling in front of a fireplace, but there was something unsettling about her eyes. It was as if she knew something no one else did. As Sarah held the photograph, she felt a sudden cold breeze brush past her. She glanced around, but there were no open windows. The air grew heavier, and the temperature in the attic seemed to drop. She shivered and put the photograph down quickly. James, too, had begun to feel uncomfortable, and they decided to leave the attic for the time being. That night, Sarah had trouble sleeping. She lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling when she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps coming from the hallway outside their bedroom door. Her pulse quickened as the footsteps grew louder, slowly making their way toward the bedroom. She held her breath, terrified that someone was outside. But when she turned to James, he was fast asleep. She couldn't understand it. There was no one else in the house. The next morning, she told James about the footsteps, and he agreed that something strange was happening. It wasn't just the little things anymore. The house seemed to have a presence, a weight to it that they couldn't explain. The air felt thick, as though something was watching them, waiting for them to acknowledge it. Feeling desperate, they contacted a local paranormal investigator, hoping for some answers. The investigator arrived the next day with an array of tools: electromagnetic field meters, infrared cameras, and audio recorders. He went through the house, carefully measuring the energy levels and listening for any signs of paranormal activity. After a few hours of investigation, he turned to Sarah and James with a serious expression. "There's definitely something here," he said. "The energy in this house is off the charts. I've recorded several anomalies, and there's a definite presence, likely the spirit of Margaret Whitmore. She's not at peace, and it's affecting the house." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What can we do?" The investigator explained that there were ways to cleanse the house: rituals, prayers, and other methods to help the spirit move on. They could help Margaret find peace, but it would take time, and it wouldn't be easy. Over the next few weeks, they worked with the investigator to perform a cleansing ritual. It was a long and exhausting process, but gradually, the atmosphere in the house began to change. The footsteps became less frequent, and the air felt lighter. The cold spots vanished, and the house no longer felt as oppressive. Sarah and James could finally breathe easy again. Though they never fully understood the events that had taken place, they came to accept that some things couldn't be explained. The house in Willow Creek had been their dream home, but it had also been a place where history, both beautiful and tragic, had left its mark. With the help of the paranormal investigator, they had learned to live with the lingering presence of Margaret Whitmore, and in time, the house became peaceful once more. Story the end.
Story number 5.
When my wife, Claire, and I first moved into the old house on Cedar Lane, we were excited. It had been a long search for the perfect place to start our family, and this house seemed ideal. Spacious, with a beautiful backyard, and in a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood. The house had been vacant for over a year, which was unusual, but it had been well-maintained, and the price was more than reasonable. It felt like a perfect fit. From the moment we moved in, things felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was a charming house with oak floors, tall windows, and intricate woodwork. The first few days were blissfully uneventful, as we settled in and made the space our own. Claire and I enjoyed the process of unpacking and arranging our furniture, imagining the life we would build in our new home. Our daughter, Emma, was still too young to fully appreciate the new surroundings, but she was already enjoying playing in the large backyard. But then, strange things began to happen. At first, it was small, almost insignificant things that we could easily explain away. Flickering lights, the occasional creak of the floorboards, that sort of thing. But as the days went on, the incidents began to feel more intentional. One evening after Emma had gone to bed, Claire and I were sitting in the living room watching TV when we heard a distinct sound from upstairs. It sounded like footsteps, but we were the only ones in the house. Emma was asleep in her room, and there were no pets. The sound was faint, almost like someone was walking in socks across the hardwood floor. It was so clear that it made us both freeze. I immediately got up and went to check, thinking it was just the house settling. But when I reached the top of the stairs, I found nothing. No one there. No sign of anything unusual. I turned off the lights and came back downstairs, trying to shake the strange feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. "Probably just the house," I told Claire, trying to calm both of us down. But Claire wasn't convinced. "It didn't sound like the house. It sounded like someone walking," she said, her voice shaky. I could see the unease in her eyes, but I shrugged it off. telling her it was probably just old plumbing or the structure shifting. The next day, as Claire was unpacking in the bedroom, she came across a small notebook wedged between the back of the dresser and the wall. The cover was old and cracked, and it was filled with handwritten notes, fragments of thoughts, memories, and strange, disconnected statements. Most of it seemed like nonsensical rambling, but the last entry made her pause. I hear her at night. She won't leave me alone. I can't make her stop. Claire was unnerved, but didn't bring it up to me right away. I was busy with work, and she didn't want to worry me. But that night, as we sat down for dinner, I could tell something was bothering her. "What's on your mind?" I asked. She hesitated before finally telling me about the notebook she had found and the strange last entry. I reassured her that it was probably just the previous owner's thoughts, but her unease remained. That night, as we were about to fall asleep, I heard it again. The soft sound of footsteps, this time closer, right outside our bedroom door. I turned to Claire, who was staring at the door, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart racing. I thought it was Emma coming down the hall, but when I checked, she was still in her room, fast asleep. I stood there listening, but the footsteps stopped. There was nothing more. I didn't know what to think. Could it have been the house settling again? Maybe. But the air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't explain. Over the next few days, the incidents grew more frequent. The footsteps continued, always at night. I would wake to the feeling of someone standing at the edge of our bed, only to find no one there when I opened my eyes. The feeling of being watched became constant. We both started sleeping with the light on, though we never discussed it out loud. Emma started waking up in the middle of the night, crying as if something was scaring her, but when I went to check, she would say the same thing every time. "The lady is in my room." I asked her who she meant, but she would only shrug, as if the answer was obvious. It was always the same vague description. "The lady. She has a white dress." At this point, I started researching the house's history, trying to find any explanation. I learned that the house had been built in the 1920s, and it had passed through several families over the years. The most recent owners, the Thompsons, had lived there for over 30 years before moving away abruptly, leaving behind only a few belongings. The rumor around the neighborhood was that they had moved after a bad experience, but no one seemed to know what exactly had happened. I couldn't help but wonder if something from the past had seeped into the walls of the house. Perhaps the Thompsons had experienced something they couldn't explain. But then I found an article that made my blood run cold. In 1935, a young woman named Margaret Thompson, no relation to the family we bought the house from, had been found dead in the house. The story was tragic. She had been a nurse who had come to care for her elderly father. He had passed away just a few months before she died, but the details were vague. The article mentioned that Margaret had died in her sleep, but there were whispers that she had been ill for some time, and that no one had been able to explain her sudden passing. Her body had been found in the upstairs bedroom, and the authorities had ruled it an accidental death, though some speculated that there had been foul play involved. Regardless, no one ever really spoke of Margaret Thompson after that. I began to feel an unease that I couldn't shake. It seemed like the footsteps and the cold spots were connected to something older, something tied to the house's history. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I sat down with Claire, and together we discussed what we should do. We couldn't ignore the strange occurrences, but we also didn't want to jump to conclusions. We contacted a paranormal investigator, a woman named Linda, who specialized in haunted houses. She arrived a week later with her equipment, including cameras, voice recorders, and other tools to help document any unusual activity. Linda set up the equipment in various rooms of the house, including the bedroom and the hallway where we'd heard the footsteps. As she worked, she asked us a few questions about our experiences, and I told her about the footsteps, the cold spots, and Emma's claims about the lady in the white dress. As night fell, Linda began her investigation, asking the spirits to reveal themselves if they were present. We all sat in the living room waiting. At one point, a camera in the hallway picked up something. The footage was grainy, but it was unmistakable. A figure in a white dress appeared at the end of the hall, standing still for a moment before slowly disappearing. We were all stunned. The figure had no face, just an impression of a woman in white. It was exactly what Emma had described. That night, Claire and I couldn't sleep. We sat up, talking softly about everything that had happened. We realized that the presence in the house had never been malicious. It was just lingering. Perhaps Margaret was still there, trapped in the house, reliving her final days. The next day, we decided to do something we hadn't thought we'd ever need to do. We had a spiritual cleansing performed on the house. Linda led the process, asking for peace and release for the spirit of Margaret. It felt almost like an exorcism, but gentle, more of a freeing, a helping spirit move on. After the cleansing, things were different. The air felt lighter. The footsteps stopped. Emma no longer spoke of the lady in the white dress. We could finally sleep through the night without fear. Eventually, the house became a home, not haunted, but filled with peace. We still think about Margaret from time to time, wondering if she ever truly found peace. But for us, the house is no longer a place of fear. It's where we found our own peace. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
When Jake and Lucy Adams moved into their new home, they were excited to start fresh. After years of renting apartments and constantly moving for work, they had finally found a place to settle. The house was a modest 2-story, nestled on the edge of a sleepy town, surrounded by tall trees and a winding dirt road. The previous owners had kept it well maintained, and it seemed like the perfect place to begin the next chapter of their lives. The house had character, a mix of old-world charm and subtle modern updates. The walls were painted a soft, neutral shade, and the floors creaked with a gentle familiarity, as though the house had stories to tell. The backyard had a small garden, and there was even a treehouse nestled in the corner of the lot. It felt like a home in every sense of the word. At first, everything seemed perfect. They unpacked, arranged their furniture, and spent long evenings talking about their plans for the house. They were both hopeful and content. But after a few days, strange things started to happen. It began with the lights. The living room light would flicker intermittently, like a bad connection. At first, they thought it was just an issue with the bulb, so Jake replaced it. But even with a new bulb, the flickering continued. The lights weren't the only things that seemed off. At night, the house would settle with strange noises, soft creaks and knocks that they couldn't explain. Again, they dismissed it as the house simply adjusting to its new occupants. But then came the first truly unsettling experience. It was a Thursday night, and Lucy was reading in the living room while Jake worked late in his office. The house was quiet, the only sound, the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Around 10:30 p.m., Lucy heard something, or rather, someone moving upstairs. She paused, listening. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking down the hallway. Lucy assumed it was Jake coming downstairs for a drink or a snack, but when she looked up, the stairs remained empty. She called out to him, but there was no response. After a few moments, the footsteps stopped. "Jake?" she called again, this time louder. Still no answer. She stood up and walked toward the stairs, but when she reached the bottom, she hesitated. The house was unusually still, and there was an eerie feeling in the air, like something was waiting. She called his name one last time, but when there was no response, she slowly ascended the stairs. As she reached the top, she glanced down the hallway. The faint light from the bathroom illuminated the area just enough for her to see, but there was no sign of Jake. The hallway was empty, and there were no signs of anyone walking around. She made her way to his office, but the door was closed. She knocked softly, then opened it, only to find Jake sitting at his desk, headphones in, completely unaware of what had just happened. "Jake, I heard someone walking upstairs," Lucy said, her voice shaky. He glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "What are you talking about? I've been here the whole time." Lucy didn't know what to think. She was sure she had heard footsteps, clear as day, coming from the hallway, but Jake was right. He had been in his office the whole time. She chalked it up to her imagination, figuring she had just been too tired. The next few days passed without incident, but the strange occurrences began to escalate. The temperature in the house would fluctuate unexpectedly, with certain rooms becoming unbearably cold, while others remained warm. At times, the air would feel thick, almost oppressive, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Then came the most disturbing event of all. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Jake and Lucy were both home. The weather was beautiful, so they decided to spend some time in the backyard. As they stepped outside, Jake noticed something strange, a shadow moving across the living room window. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but when he looked closer, he saw the distinct outline of a figure standing in the window. "Lucy, did you see that?" Jake asked, his voice tense. Lucy turned to look at the window, but there was no one there. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her brow furrowed. Jake walked toward the house, his heart racing. He peeked through the window, but the room was empty. No one was inside. He turned back to Lucy, but her confused expression didn't help him make sense of what he had just seen. "I swear I saw someone standing there," he muttered. "In the window." Lucy shook her head, not sure what to make of it. "Maybe it's just the shadows, Jake." But Jake wasn't convinced. There was something about it, something that made him feel like they weren't alone in the house. That night, things took a turn for the worse. Lucy was having trouble falling asleep, restless and uneasy. The house felt cold, despite the warmth of the blankets, and the usual comforting creaks of the house felt unnervingly loud in the silence. As she lay there, trying to calm her racing thoughts, she heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat. She sat up in bed, her breath shallow. She listened for a moment, and sure enough, there it was again, footsteps, pacing back and forth in the hallway outside their bedroom door. "Jake," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" Jake groggily opened his eyes and listened. The footsteps continued, growing louder. His face paled, and he sat up, his eyes wide with confusion. "Stay here," he said softly. "I'll check it out." He grabbed his phone and flashlight and carefully opened the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the bathroom at the far end. Jake crept down the hall, his footsteps almost inaudible on the wooden floors. As he passed the guest bedroom, the door creaked open by itself. Jake froze. He stared at the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. The room was pitch black, but he could have sworn he saw something, someone, standing just inside the door. The figure was faint, like a shadow, but there was no mistaking it. It looked like a person, though there was something off about the shape. "Lucy, come here," Jake shouted, his voice trembling. Lucy rushed to his side, her face pale. Together, they stared at the darkened room, too afraid to move. The figure in the doorway shifted as though it were aware of their presence. It stepped into the dim light, but before they could make out any details, it vanished. The room was empty. The temperature in the hallway dropped sharply, and the air felt heavy, like they were being watched. "Let's go," Lucy whispered, tugging at Jake's arm. "We're leaving." They didn't waste any time. They grabbed a few things and drove to a nearby hotel that night. The next day, they returned to the house, but it was clear that they couldn't stay any longer. The atmosphere was oppressive, like the house was holding them captive. They moved out within a week, and as they did, they spoke to the neighbors. It turned out that the house had a history, an unsettling one. The previous owners had lived there for only a few months before leaving abruptly. No one knew exactly why, but there were rumors of strange happenings, of footsteps, whispers, and shadows in the corners of the rooms. The house had a reputation, but no one had been brave enough to ask about it until now. As they packed up their belongings and left, Jake and Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching them. They never returned to the house again, and after a few months it was sold to new owners. But to this day, they sometimes hear footsteps in the night, and when they look outside their windows, they still wonder, is someone watching them, waiting for them to return? Story the end.
Story number 7.
When Sarah and Ben purchased their first home, it felt like the perfect opportunity to start fresh. After years of renting cramped apartments in the city, they finally had a space they could call their own. A charming 2-story house with a red brick facade, large windows, and a big backyard perfect for their dog, Daisy. It was located in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the edge of town, where the streets were lined with tall trees and the sounds of nature filled the air. The house was older, built in the late 1920s, but it had been well taken care of. There were minor cosmetic updates, but the original hardwood floors and intricate molding gave the house a sense of character and history. They moved in excitedly, making it their own, unpacking boxes and slowly adjusting to life in their new home. The first week was blissful. Everything was perfect. Daisy loved the large yard, and Sarah and Ben spent evenings on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze. But as the second week passed, they began to notice strange occurrences. It started with small things, easy to dismiss. One morning, Sarah came downstairs to find the kitchen light on, though she was sure she had turned it off the night before. Ben shrugged it off as a mistake. Maybe he'd forgotten. A few days later, Ben found his keys in a different spot than where he remembered leaving them. He was certain he'd left them on the counter, but they were now sitting on the coffee table. Again, they thought nothing of it, attributing it to their busy lives and the stress of moving. Then came the noises. It started one night after they had gone to bed. Ben was reading in bed while Sarah was already asleep when he heard what sounded like footsteps downstairs. He froze, listening intently. The house was still, aside from the occasional creak of the floorboards. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, like someone walking across the living room floor. Ben got out of bed and quietly made his way down the stairs, thinking it might be Daisy scratching at the door, or maybe the wind making the house settle. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, the living room was empty. Daisy was curled up in her bed, sound asleep. There was no one there. He felt a chill run down his spine, but tried to rationalize it. It was an old house, after all. Houses creak and groan as they settle. Ben shrugged it off and returned to bed. The next night, the same thing happened. Sarah, now wide awake, heard the footsteps too, and this time it sounded like something or someone was pacing back and forth across the floor. She nudged Ben, but by the time he got out of bed, the footsteps had stopped. The house was still. He reassured her that it was just the house settling, but Sarah wasn't so sure. The atmosphere felt strange, heavy almost, as though something was lurking just out of sight. The following week, the occurrences began to escalate. One afternoon, as Sarah was putting away groceries, she heard faint whispers coming from the hallway. At first, she thought it was the wind or perhaps a neighbor talking outside, but the whispers seemed to come from inside the house. She felt a cold chill brush past her like someone had walked by, but when she turned, no one was there. The whispers continued for a few more seconds before fading away. She called Ben over, but he didn't hear anything. He looked at her quizzically and suggested that it was just the pipes or the wind again, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That evening, she found a picture frame in the living room that had been knocked over. She was sure she had placed it on the mantel earlier, but it was now lying face down on the coffee table. The next few days were filled with similar occurrences. Objects being moved, shadows darting across rooms, and doors creaking open on their own. One evening, Sarah was in the kitchen when she saw the door to the basement slowly swing open. She stood frozen, her heart pounding, unsure whether she had left it ajar or if it had opened on its own. She had been in the basement earlier that day, but she was certain she had closed the door behind her. The final straw came one evening when Sarah was alone in the house. Ben had gone out with friends, and Daisy was in the backyard. Sarah was folding laundry in the upstairs hallway when she heard a loud bang coming from the guest bedroom. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was unmistakable, like something heavy had fallen to the floor. She cautiously walked toward the guest room, her mind racing. The door was shut, but when she opened it, she found nothing amiss. The room was exactly as it had been when they moved in, dusty, untouched, and empty. But the air in the room was thick, like something was suffocating it. Sarah closed the door quickly, her hands trembling. That night, when Ben returned, Sarah told him everything. She described the whispers, the footsteps, and the mysterious noises that had been haunting them. Ben was skeptical but agreed that something felt off about the house. He suggested they do some research to see if there was any history to explain what was happening. The next day, they went to the local library to look up the house's history. After a few hours of digging through old records, they discovered something unsettling. The house had been built in the late 1920s, and over the years, it had changed owners several times. One family, the Millers, had lived there for decades before abruptly moving out in the 1950s. The town historian mentioned that the family had left quickly, and no one knew why. There were rumors, though, rumors of strange happenings, odd noises at night, and a growing sense of unease in the house. No one ever confirmed what had happened, but the Millers never returned. The final detail in the library records was the most chilling. In the early 1940s, the Miller family's young daughter, Emily, had passed away unexpectedly at the age of 6. The cause of death was never fully explained, and her death had left the family devastated. Sarah and Ben looked at each other, both feeling an icy sensation crawl up their spines. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The house was eerily quiet, but the weight of its history hung over her. She felt watched, like someone was standing just beyond her line of sight. As she lay in bed, trying to calm her racing thoughts, she heard it again, the faint whispering. This time it was clearer, like a child's voice. The voice called her name. Sarah! She gasped and sat up, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned to Ben, but he was sound asleep, unaware of the presence that seemed to fill the room. The voice spoke again, this time closer. Sarah. She slowly got out of bed and crept toward the door. When she opened it, the hallway was empty. But the air was cold, and the whispers continued, though she could not make out the words. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Sarah's legs felt weak, and she hurried back to bed, pulling the covers over her head, trying to block out the strange sensation. The next day, Ben suggested they contact a local paranormal investigator, someone who had experience with these types of things. Sarah was reluctant, but she had reached her breaking point. They needed answers. The investigator, a woman named Clara, came to the house the following week. She spent several hours walking through the rooms, asking questions and using various tools to detect any signs of paranormal activity. At the end of her visit, Clara confirmed what Sarah and Ben had feared. The house was haunted. Clara explained that the spirits of those who had lived there before, particularly young Emily, were still attached to the home. Emily's restless spirit had been drawn to the house after her tragic death, and she had been trying to communicate with Sarah and Ben. Clara recommended they conduct a cleansing ritual to help ease the spirit's unrest. With Clara's help, Sarah and Ben performed the cleansing, lighting candles and reciting prayers to help Emily move on. It was a long and emotionally draining process, but by the end of the night, the atmosphere in the house felt lighter. The cold, oppressive air lifted, and the whispers stopped. In the weeks that followed, the house felt different. There were no more footsteps, no more whispers, and the air felt fresh again. Sarah and Ben were able to return to their daily lives, but the memory of the haunting lingered. They never forgot the presence they had felt in the house. And though the spirit of Emily had moved on, the experience had changed them forever. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
We'd been searching for the perfect house for months, and when we found it, I couldn't believe our luck. The house on Cypress Hill was exactly what we'd been hoping for. Old, but not too old. Spacious, with a large backyard and a view that stretched across the valley. The price was right, and the neighborhood was quiet, just far enough out of town to feel peaceful, but close enough for convenience. We couldn't wait to make it our own. The previous owners, a middle-aged couple, had lived there for years. They had decided to downsize and had already moved into a smaller home, leaving the house empty. When we toured the place, the realtor told us it had been on the market for a while, but no one seemed interested in it. Not sure why, she said. It's a beautiful home. There was something charming about the house. The creaky wooden floors, the tall ceilings, the wide windows that let in so much light. I loved the large fireplace in the living room and the old-fashioned details like the crown molding and vintage fixtures. It felt like the kind of house you could spend a lifetime in. The first few weeks were blissful. We unpacked boxes, redecorated, and tried to settle into our new life. Nathan, my husband, was the practical one. He focused on fixing the small issues we'd noticed during our walkthrough, like a leaky faucet and a few drafty windows. I, on the other hand, was excited to start a new chapter, to make the place feel like home. We spent evenings on the porch watching the sunset, and every morning I was greeted by the warm rays of the sun streaming through the living room windows. But then, slowly, things started to change. It was subtle at first. I'd hear footsteps when no one was around, or the sound of something faintly tapping on the walls. Sometimes I'd be in the kitchen, and I could feel someone standing behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. Nathan, of course, didn't believe me. "It's just an old house," he'd say. "They all do that. It's nothing." I didn't say anything, but I started to wonder if I was imagining things. After all, it wasn't uncommon for old houses to settle, for pipes to creak, or floors to groan. I tried to convince myself that it was just the house adjusting to its new owners. One afternoon, while Nathan was at work, I was sitting in the living room, reading a book. I'd been hearing a faint tapping sound for a while, almost like someone was lightly knocking on the walls. It was rhythmic, and at first I thought it was just the house settling again. But as I sat there, the sound grew louder and more distinct. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stood up and walked toward the hallway, where the sound seemed to be coming from. I froze. At the end of the hallway, the door to the basement was wide open. I was certain I had closed it earlier that day, but now it was open, and the sound was coming from down there. I hesitated for a moment, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped cautiously toward the basement door, the sound of the knocking growing louder with each step. I reached the door and peered down the stairs, but it was too dark to see anything. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and turned it on, shining it down into the basement. The light revealed nothing unusual, just old boxes, a few tools, and a couple of storage bins. But the knocking continued. I mustered up the courage to descend the stairs, my heart racing with every step. The sound seemed to be coming from one of the old wooden beams in the ceiling. I reached out, brushing my hand against the cold, splintered wood. That's when it stopped. The knocking, the movement, everything. It was silent. I quickly backed up the stairs, my mind racing. I couldn't make sense of it. But I wasn't alone in this. That night, after Nathan came home, I told him everything. He listened, nodding as I described the sound and the strange feeling in the basement. "It's probably just rats or something," he said with a shrug. He didn't seem fazed at all. "You're overthinking it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I began to pay closer attention to the little things, the sudden cold drafts in rooms with no windows, the faint flicker of the lights when no one was near them. It wasn't enough to be frightening, but it was enough to make me uncomfortable. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. It came from the kitchen. I stood frozen, listening. It was a woman's voice, soft, almost whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I walked into the kitchen, but there was no one there. That night, I told Nathan again. This time, I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He hadn't heard the voice, but he had been hearing things too. He had been waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was watching him. The cold drafts in the hallway had gotten stronger, and he had started to notice the flickering lights too. It was then that we both agreed we needed to figure out what was going on. The next day, I called a local historian, hoping to learn more about the house's history. I was looking for answers, anything that might explain the strange happenings. The historian told me that the house had been built in the late 1800s and that it had passed through several families over the years. The most recent family, the ones who had sold it to us, had lived there for decades. But there was one thing that caught my attention. The historian told me that one of the earlier families had experienced a tragedy, a fire that had killed a young woman named Clara. Clara had been the daughter of the first owners of the house, and she had died in the fire when she was just 18. The fire had destroyed much of the second floor, and Clara's body had been found in her room, but her parents had insisted that she had been trying to save something. No one knew what, but it was believed that she was still attached to the house, lingering in some way. When I heard the story, a chill ran down my spine. It sounded like the beginning of a ghost story, but it didn't feel like fiction. It felt real. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt heavier, as if the air had thickened with the weight of its past. I tossed and turned, and then, just before I drifted off to sleep, I heard it again. The voice, clearer now, as though someone was right next to my ear. "Help me." I shot up in bed, my heart racing. I turned to Nathan, but he was still asleep, oblivious. The voice hadn't been in my head. It had been real. The next morning, I told Nathan everything. This time, he didn't dismiss it. We both agreed that we needed to do something. We found a local paranormal investigator who had experience with older homes. She agreed to come over and take a look at the house. When she arrived, she immediately sensed something was off. She led us through the house, pausing in certain rooms, feeling the air as if searching for something. When we reached the basement, she stopped in her tracks. "This is where she is," she said softly, her voice distant. "She's attached to this place." The investigator performed a brief ritual, asking Clara to leave the house and move on. The atmosphere in the room felt tense, but after a few moments, the air lightened. The temperature returned to normal, and the house no longer felt as heavy. We didn't know if it worked, but over the next few days, the strange occurrences stopped. The footsteps, the knocking, the voice, it all faded away. The house felt like a home again. I still think about Clara sometimes. I don't know if she ever truly left, but I hope she found peace. Living in that house changed me. It made me believe that there are things in this world that we can't always explain. I'm not sure what happened there, but I know that whatever it was real. And in some way, I think Clara and I made a kind of peace with one another. Story the end.
Story number 9.
Maggie and Mark had always dreamed of buying a house with a little more space, somewhere quiet with a garden for their dog, and a cozy place to settle down. When they found their new home, an older but charming 3-bedroom house, they didn't hesitate. It was tucked on a quiet street in a small town, with a large yard surrounded by trees. The house itself had been built in the late 1800s, but it had been well taken care of and had all the character they were looking for. The price was surprisingly affordable, even though it seemed perfect for their budget. The previous owners, an elderly couple, had moved to a retirement home, and they left the house largely furnished. It wasn't until Maggie and Mark were moving in that they realized just how much the old owners had left behind. The attic was full of boxes, and there were small knickknacks and photos scattered all over the house. Maggie found it endearing that the couple had taken such care of their belongings, but Mark was more practical. He was eager to get started with settling in and making the house feel like their own. The first few days were blissfully normal. They spent time unpacking, getting to know the neighborhood, and enjoying the peace and quiet. But as they started to settle in, strange things began to happen. It started with little things, easy to dismiss. The smell of something faintly floral that seemed to come and go in the kitchen, a light flickering in the hallway at odd times, or the sound of footsteps in the upstairs hall when no one was there. Maggie shrugged it off as the house settling, a natural consequence of living in an older home. Mark, who wasn't particularly superstitious, agreed with her. Probably just the plumbing or the wood creaking, he'd say. But it wasn't long before the occurrences became more difficult to ignore. One evening, as Mark was in the kitchen making dinner, Maggie was sitting in the living room reading a book. Suddenly, she heard a soft, distinct voice calling her name. It was a woman's voice, faint but clear. She jumped to her feet, her heart racing, but when she went into the kitchen, Mark was standing at the counter, chopping vegetables. "Did you just call me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark raised an eyebrow. "No, I didn't say anything." Maggie's mind raced, but she convinced herself it was nothing more than her imagination. Still, the voice had been so clear. The thought lingered in her mind as she tried to shake it off. Later that week, Maggie was in the attic sorting through some old boxes. Among the clutter of old newspapers, clothes, and furniture, she found a collection of photographs. The pictures were old, black and white images of the house from when it was first built. The people in the photos were clearly from another time, men and women dressed in vintage clothing, standing in front of the house in different seasons. But what caught Maggie's attention was one particular photo, a photo of a woman standing alone in front of the house. She looked sad, her face pale, and her eyes were fixed on the camera. Something about the image unsettled Maggie, and she quickly tucked it away, deciding to look at it later. That night, Maggie couldn't get the image of the woman out of her mind. As she lay in bed, she found herself thinking about the house's history. Who had lived there before them? Why had the house been so affordable? The following night, the atmosphere in the house felt different. Mark had gone out to meet some friends, and Maggie stayed behind to clean up the kitchen. As she was wiping down the counter, she heard a faint tapping on the floor above her, coming from the hallway upstairs. At first, she thought it might be the house settling again, but the sound was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like someone was walking around. Curious but cautious, she made her way up the stairs. As she reached the top, the tapping stopped. The hall was empty. Her heart raced as she checked each room, but everything seemed normal. She shook her head, telling herself she was just imagining things, and went back downstairs. The next few days passed without much incident, but Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She found herself looking over her shoulder more often, sensing something lingering just beyond her sight. The cold spots in the house became more frequent, especially in the hallway upstairs where the tapping sound had come from. One afternoon, as Maggie was tidying up, she heard the sound again, this time louder, more insistent. It was coming from the same hallway. She hesitated for a moment, then gathered the courage to go upstairs. As she walked toward the hallway, the temperature dropped suddenly. She could see her breath in the air, even though the rest of the house was warm. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she moved slowly down the hall. That was when she saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of the hallway. It was a figure standing at the end of the corridor. The figure didn't move, but Maggie felt its presence deeply. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she took a step back, but the shadow didn't move. Terrified, Maggie ran downstairs, but as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard the sound of a door slamming shut upstairs. She looked toward the staircase and saw Mark standing in the doorway, looking confused. "Hey, what's going on? Why are you freaking out?" he asked. Maggie couldn't explain it. The house felt different now, like it was full of whispers and strange presences. But she didn't want to sound irrational, so she simply said, "I don't know. It's probably nothing. Just the house being old, I guess." Mark gave her a skeptical look but didn't press the issue further. Over the next few weeks, things only seemed to escalate. The voices grew louder and the shadows more distinct. Maggie began to hear whispers in the middle of the night, soft voices calling her name, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. And the figure in the hallway began to appear more frequently. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But it felt so real. One evening, Maggie finally sat down with Mark and told him everything. She explained the voices, the shadows, the cold spots, and the feeling that they were being watched. Mark listened quietly, then took a deep breath. "Maybe we should look into the history of the house," he said. "See if there's anything that might explain what's been happening." That was when they learned about the house's previous owners. The elderly couple who had lived there before them had been the last in a long line of tenants. But there was one other story that stood out. The woman in the photograph that Maggie had found in the attic was named Eleanor, the original owner of the house. She had lived there with her husband, but after he died in an accident, Eleanor became increasingly isolated. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house, tapping on the walls, voices in the night, but no one ever saw Eleanor after a certain point. It was said that she had passed away in the house, alone and forgotten, and her spirit had never left. Maggie's heart sank as she read about Eleanor's tragic life. The story seemed to align with everything they had experienced. The tapping, the cold spots, the shadowy figure. It all made sense now. Eleanor's restless spirit had never moved on, and it seemed to be reaching out to Maggie and Mark. That night, they decided to try to communicate with her. They lit a candle in the living room and sat in silence, waiting. They called out to Eleanor, asking her to make her presence known. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the room grew colder, and the candle flickered wildly. A voice, soft, almost like a sigh, whispered through the air, "I am here." Maggie felt a chill run through her, but this time there was no fear. There was a sense of understanding, of knowing that Eleanor was simply lost, alone in the house she had once loved. In the days that followed, the house seemed to calm. The shadows faded, the voices grew quieter, and the temperature returned to normal. Maggie and Mark continued to live in the house, but they never forgot the spirit of Eleanor. They respected her presence, and every now and then, they would light a candle and speak her name, hoping she had finally found the piece she had been searching for. Story the end.
Story number 10.
In the fall of 2022, Emma and Ben Matthews found their perfect house, a charming 2-story colonial in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house had been on the market for months, which had made it seem like a hidden gem. It was well maintained with modern updates, and the price was within their budget, a rare combination. The moment they stepped inside, they knew it was the one. The sun streamed in through large windows, and the wooden floors creaked with a sense of history. The backyard was spacious, with a tall oak tree in the center, its branches reaching out like open arms. Moving in was an exhausting but exciting experience. They were thrilled about their new life and eager to make it their own. At first, everything felt perfect. The house had a cozy, welcoming atmosphere, and every room had a touch of charm. They unpacked quickly, setting up their furniture, organizing the kitchen, and choosing the perfect spot for their family photos. But after the first few nights, things started to feel off. It began with the little things, the flickering lights that would come and go without warning, or the doors that seemed to close by themselves. Emma chalked it up to the old wiring and the natural settling of a house that had been standing for over 100 years. Ben, who was less superstitious, was content to ignore the oddities. However, on the third night, things took a turn. Emma had just finished reading in bed when she heard a soft tapping noise coming from the hallway outside their bedroom. At first, she assumed it was the wind or a tree branch brushing against the window. But the tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone knocking on the door. She got out of bed and opened the door, expecting to find Ben, but the hallway was empty. The tapping stopped as soon as she stepped into the hallway. Her heart was pounding, but she tried to shake it off, blaming the sound on the old house settling. The next day, Emma mentioned the incident to Ben, but he didn't seem too concerned. He had always been the practical one. Still, Emma couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, she heard the same tapping noise again. This time, it was accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps. "Ben, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ben paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He listened for a moment, then shook his head. "It's probably just the house, Emma. These old places make strange noises." But that night, the tapping escalated. It sounded like someone was walking down the hallway, their footsteps growing louder with each passing moment. Emma lay in bed, wide awake, listening to the sound inch closer to their bedroom door. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. Terrified, Emma turned to Ben. "Ben, we need to get out of here." Ben, still half asleep, mumbled something about it being a dream. But Emma couldn't ignore it any longer. She felt like they were being watched. She felt like the house itself was alive. The next day, Emma decided to investigate the history of the house. She went to the local library and combed through old newspapers and records, hoping to find something that would explain the strange occurrences. After hours of searching, she finally found a mention of the house in a 1920s article. It was about the original owner, Thomas Parker, a wealthy businessman who had built the house in 1910. According to the article, Thomas Parker's wife, Margaret, had mysteriously disappeared one night, and the police were never able to solve the case. Some neighbors claimed to have seen her wandering the streets late at night, but no one had ever been able to confirm her whereabouts. The article didn't offer much more, but it was enough to send a chill down Emma's spine. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to talk to Ben about it again, but he was convinced it was all in her head. He had grown frustrated with her fears, but Emma couldn't ignore the unease that had settled deep within her. She began to feel like she wasn't alone in the house, like there was something or someone else living there with them. One evening, as Emma was alone in the living room, she heard the unmistakable sound of a woman's voice, faint but clear, calling her name from the hallway. "Emma." Frozen in place, Emma stared at the dark hallway, her breath catching in her throat. She stood up slowly, heart racing, and walked cautiously toward the source of the voice. As she passed the staircase, the air grew inexplicably cold. She reached the hallway and found nothing. The house was eerily silent. The voice had sounded so real, so close. Emma spent the next few days researching the house further. She learned from a neighbor that Thomas Parker had built the house for his wife Margaret, whom he adored. However, after her disappearance, the house had been sold several times, with the new owners never staying long. There were rumors that Margaret had been involved in a tragic accident, but no one could ever confirm the details. One evening, as Emma was cleaning out the attic, she found an old trunk tucked away in a corner. It was covered in dust, but it seemed to call out to her. She opened it, revealing a collection of personal items, old letters, photographs, and a delicate lace handkerchief. There was also a small wooden box with a brass clasp. Emma's heart raced as she opened the box and found a ring, an intricate silver band set with a small, dark stone. The ring looked old, and the moment she touched it, a cold shiver ran down her spine. At that moment, the tapping began again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Emma's eyes darted around the attic, her pulse quickening. She could feel the presence of someone behind her, watching her. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the very walls of the house were closing in around her. "Ben!" she shouted, but her voice was shaky. "Ben!" The footsteps grew louder, and the attic light flickered. The temperature dropped suddenly, and Emma could see her breath in the air. She spun around to see a figure standing at the far end of the attic. A woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing with long, dark hair hanging in loose waves. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring at Emma with hollow eyes. Emma's blood ran cold. The figure began to fade into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Ben rushed up the stairs, calling her name. When he found her in the attic, she was pale and trembling. "I saw her," Emma whispered. "I saw her, the woman." Ben tried to comfort her, but she couldn't stop shaking. That night, as they lay in bed, the whispers started again. This time, they were clearer, guttural, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from within the walls. Ben tried to ignore it, but Emma couldn't. The next morning, Emma convinced Ben to visit the local cemetery, hoping to find answers. There, in the oldest section of the graveyard, they found Margaret Parker's grave. The inscription was simple: Margaret Parker, beloved wife, 1885-1922. As they stood there, Emma felt a strange sensation, like a presence was standing beside her. She looked around, but there was no one else there. Suddenly, the air grew thick, and the ground seemed to vibrate beneath her feet. "Leave this place," a voice whispered, soft and chilling. Emma and Ben left immediately. That night, they packed their things and left the house, knowing that they couldn't stay there any longer. When they returned to the house the next day to gather the last of their belongings, they noticed something strange. The house was still. It felt silent in a way that was unnatural. The tapping, the footsteps, and the whispers were all gone. But the air was thick with a sense of finality. They took one last look around, and as they stepped out of the front door, they heard it, a soft, sad voice calling their names one last time. Story the end.
Story number 11.
When Elise and Mark bought the house, it felt like a dream come true. A sprawling craftsman-style home on the outskirts of town, surrounded by woods and rolling hills, it seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. It had history, charm, and, as the realtor put it, loads of character. Elise was the one who fell in love first. She admired the stained glass windows in the foyer, the original hardwood floors, and the cozy stone fireplace in the living room. Mark was drawn to the idea of having space, room to build a workshop in the detached garage, and enough land to plant a vegetable garden. They moved in during the early days of autumn, eager to make it their own. The first few nights were uneventful, apart from the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling. Elise joked about the place having personality, and Mark teased her about being jumpy. But then, small things started happening. It began with the lights. One night, as Elise was unpacking boxes in the kitchen, the overhead light flickered. She looked up, expecting to see a dying bulb, but the light stayed steady. She shrugged it off until it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Soon, it wasn't just the kitchen. The hallway light would dim, the bedroom lamp would turn on by itself, and once the porch light refused to turn off, no matter how many times Mark flipped the switch. Then came the noises. Soft, muffled thuds like footsteps on carpet echoed from the upstairs hallway at odd hours. Mark insisted it was the house shifting or an animal in the walls, but Elise wasn't so sure. One night, as she lay in bed, she swore she heard someone whisper her name. The voice was faint, almost imperceptible, but it made her heart race. When she told Mark, he brushed it off as her imagination. The atmosphere in the house began to change. Elise noticed it first. Rooms that had felt warm and inviting now seemed heavy, oppressive. The air felt thicker, and the faint smell of something metallic lingered in certain corners. She avoided the basement altogether. Every time she stood at the top of the stairs, she felt a deep, inexplicable dread. One evening, while Mark was working late, Elise decided to tackle the boxes in the attic. She'd been putting it off for weeks, but the clutter was starting to bother her. The attic was accessed by a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. As she climbed up, a chill ran through her, despite the attic being stuffy and warm. The space was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from a frayed cord. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled musty. Elise opened a few boxes and sorted through old knickknacks and holiday decorations. Then she noticed a wooden trunk shoved into the far corner, partially obscured by a tattered sheet. Curious, she pulled the sheet away and opened the trunk. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a few children's toys, a wooden horse, a porcelain doll, and a tiny tea set. The photographs were faded, but Elise could make out a family, a mother, father, and 2 young children. The letters were addressed to a Margaret Whitmore and spoke of daily life, hardships, and an overwhelming sense of loss. As Elise sifted through the items, she felt a sudden chill, as if a draft had blown through the attic. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she had the overwhelming sensation of being watched. She turned quickly, but the attic was empty. That night, the dreams began. Elise dreamt of a woman in a dark dress standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her with empty, hollow eyes. She couldn't move or scream, paralyzed by an invisible force. When she finally woke, her chest was tight and she was drenched in sweat. The dreams came every night after that, each one more vivid than the last. Mark started to notice changes in Elise. She was jumpy, distracted, and complained of feeling cold even when the heat was on. He also began experiencing strange occurrences. Tools would go missing from his workshop and reappear in odd places like the bathroom or the kitchen counter. One night, he woke to the sound of someone walking down the hallway, only to find no one there. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Elise was home alone, folding laundry in the living room when she heard a crash from the kitchen. She ran to investigate and found a glass shattered on the floor, though she hadn't left any glasses out. As she bent down to clean up the mess, the lights flickered violently, and the radio on the counter turned on by itself, blasting static. "Who's there?" Elise shouted, her voice trembling. The static stopped abruptly, replaced by a low hum. The temperature in the room plummeted, and for a moment Elise could see her breath. Then she heard it. A child's laughter, faint and echoing, coming from the hallway. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her phone and fled the house, calling Mark in tears. When Mark got home, he found Elise sitting in the car, refusing to go back inside. "Something is wrong with this house," she told him. "I'm not crazy, Mark. There's something here." Reluctantly, Mark agreed to call a local historian who specialized in the town's older homes. The man, Mr. Harris, came by the next day and listened intently as Elise recounted their experiences. He nodded knowingly and asked if they'd ever heard of the Whitmore family. The Whitmores, he explained, had lived in the house during the early 1900s. The family suffered a series of tragedies. The father died in a logging accident, the son drowned in a nearby creek, and the daughter fell ill and passed away shortly after. Margaret Whitmore, the mother, was said to have succumbed to grief and took her own life in the attic. Since then, rumors of strange occurrences had plagued the house's history. Elise and Mark were horrified. Mr. Harris suggested a cleansing ritual to help ease the spirits and bring peace to the home. Desperate for relief, they agreed. That weekend, Mr. Harris returned with a bundle of sage, candles, and a bell. He guided Elise and Mark through each room, reciting prayers and asking the spirits to move on. The atmosphere felt lighter as they progressed, but when they reached the attic, the temperature dropped sharply. The bell in Mr. Harris's hand began to ring on its own, and the door slammed shut behind them. Elise gripped Mark's hand as Mr. Harris stood firm, continuing the ritual. The air seemed to pulse, heavy with energy, and a shadowy figure appeared in the corner. It was Margaret, her form faint but unmistakable. Her expression was one of sorrow, not malice. "We're sorry for what happened to you," Elise whispered through tears. "You don't have to stay here anymore." Margaret's figure lingered for a moment, then slowly faded, taking the oppressive chill with her. The room fell silent, and the atmosphere felt calm. After that day, the house changed. The lights stopped flickering, the footsteps ceased, and Elise's dreams were replaced with restful sleep. They kept Margaret's belongings in a small chest in the attic, a tribute to the family who had lived there before them. Though the house was peaceful, Elise sometimes felt a soft, comforting presence as she went about her day, a reminder that they weren't entirely alone, but that whatever lingered now meant no harm.